Ardennes Forest, December 23, 1944, 06:15 hours, and Oberstleutnant Friedrich Hoffman, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, stands at his forward observation post, watching 3 companies of his grenadiers advance through snow-covered terrain toward American positions near Bastogne. Confident that his men can endure the inevitable American artillery barrage using the dispersal tactics and trench discipline that have protected German infantry throughout 5 years of war. His 890 soldiers move in extended formation across open ground, maintaining intervals that ensure no single airburst can kill more than 2 or 3 men, following doctrine perfected through countless battles where survival against artillery meant spreading out and moving quickly through the beaten zone. What Oberstleutnant Hoffman cannot possibly know, what no German officer could imagine despite their extensive experience with American firepower, is that 60% of the shells now screaming toward his battalion contain a miniaturized radio transmitter no larger than a light bulb that automatically detonates each round at the precise height above ground to maximize the lethal radius of shrapnel. And within 8 minutes, these proximity-fused shells will transform his carefully dispersed formation into a killing field where men die in groups of 15 or 20 despite spacing that should protect them, where traditional infantry tactics become suicide, and where German survivors will send frantic reports describing shells that know where we are and explosions that hunt soldiers like living things. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The confidence of German forces in their ability to survive artillery fire comes from 5 years of combat experience across multiple theaters, from the systematic study of enemy weapons and tactics, and from the development of countermeasures that have proven effective against conventional artillery. Major Karl Steiner, operations officer for the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, has analyzed American artillery capabilities extensively, noting their preference for massed, time-on-target barrages that concentrate hundreds of rounds on specific areas, their use of mechanical time fuses that require careful calculation to achieve airburst effects, and their reliance on forward observers to direct fire. German defensive doctrine addresses all these factors. Dispersal defeats area weapons by reducing casualties per shell burst. Movement through artillery zones minimizes exposure time, and aggressive counter-battery fire forces American observers to stay hidden rather than directing accurate fire. Oberstleutnant Hoffman's battalion represents elite German infantry, soldiers averaging 19 years of age but trained to standards that emphasize initiative, tactical flexibility, and the aggressive action that has characterized German military operations since 1939. Hauptmann Werner Koch, commanding 6th Company, has drilled his 140 grenadiers in the specific techniques for surviving artillery fire, maintaining 10-meter intervals between soldiers that ensure no single airburst can wound more than 3 men, using terrain features that provide overhead cover or defilade from shell fragments, moving rapidly through areas targeted by enemy fire rather than going to ground, where follow-up rounds can find stationary targets. These tactics have proven effective throughout the war, allowing German infantry to advance despite Allied artillery superiority by accepting limited casualties as unavoidable, while preventing the catastrophic losses that would break unit cohesion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The German understanding of artillery technology and its limitations shapes their tactical doctrine and defensive measures. Artillery shells traditionally require either direct impact to detonate or mechanical time fuses set before firing to achieve airburst effects. Impact fuses are relatively simple and reliable, but only effective if shells strike something solid. A direct hit on a soldier or equipment, or ground detonation that creates a spray of fragments in a relatively narrow cone. Time fuses allow shells to explode in the air above targets, spreading fragments over wider areas, but require accurate range estimation and fuse setting that German experience suggests Allied gunners achieve only 30 to 40% of the time. A time-fused shell set incorrectly explodes too high, wasting fragments above targets, or too low, essentially becoming a ground burst with reduced effective radius. German infantry trained to recognize the difference between properly timed airbursts and poorly set ones, adjusting their tactics accordingly. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, squad leader in 6th Company, carries in his mind the statistics that define artillery survival. A properly fused airburst has a lethal radius of approximately 35 meters against standing troops, 20 meters against soldiers prone behind cover, and minimal effect beyond 50 meters where fragments lose velocity. By maintaining 10-meter spacing, his squad ensures that even a perfectly placed airburst will wound at most 2 or 3 men rather than destroying the entire unit. By moving rapidly rather than remaining stationary, they minimize the probability that American gunners can adjust fire to catch them in subsequent volleys. These are the lessons of 5 years of war, paid for in casualties, but validated by the survival of units that follow proper tactics. The American artillery supporting operations around Bastogne includes multiple battalions of 105mm and 155mm howitzers, weapons the Germans respect for their volume of fire and the efficiency of American fire direction centers that can mass fires from multiple batteries on short notice. Intelligence reports describe American artillery as well supplied with ammunition, responsive to requests from forward observers, and capable of delivering devastating barrages when properly directed. However, German experience suggests that American gunnery accuracy remains average, that their time fuses are no more reliable than German equivalents, and that dispersed, rapidly moving infantry can traverse American fire zones with acceptable casualties. This assessment, based on extensive combat experience, will prove catastrophically wrong within minutes. What makes December 23, 1944 fundamentally different from every previous artillery engagement in the European theater is not immediately apparent to German observers watching American gun positions through binoculars. The howitzers appear identical to those encountered in previous battles. M2A1 105mm and M1 155mm pieces served by efficiently trained American crews, positioned in battery formations that allow coordinated fire, supplied by the seemingly endless logistics that characterize American operations. Intelligence has noted increased American artillery activity over recent days, attributed to improved supply lines now that weather has cleared and Allied air superiority can protect logistics movements. Nothing suggests that the shells now being loaded into those howitzers contain technology that will revolutionize artillery warfare. The development of the VT, Variable Time Proximity Fuse, represents one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets, a technological breakthrough that combines miniaturized radio equipment, vacuum tubes smaller than a fingernail, batteries that activate on firing, and detonators that function reliably despite forces exceeding 20,000 Gs during gun firing. The project, designated T-98 and later M-47 in American nomenclature, began in 1940 when British scientists recognized that conventional anti-aircraft fire achieved hit rates below 1% because timed fuses could not reliably predict aircraft positions. The National Defense Research Committee assigned Section T to develop a proximity fuse, bringing together experts in radio, electronics, mechanical engineering, and explosives to create a weapon that seemed impossible, a miniaturized radio system rugged enough to survive artillery firing while sensitive enough to detect targets and detonate at optimal range. The technical challenges of proximity fuse development seemed insurmountable. Dr. Merle Tuve, director of Section T at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, faced the problem of creating vacuum tubes that could withstand acceleration forces that shatter conventional glass tubes, designing radio circuits that function reliably when subjected to extreme shock and vibration, developing batteries that activate instantly on firing and provide power for the brief seconds between gun muzzle and target, and packaging all components in a space no larger than the nose of an artillery shell. The initial prototypes failed catastrophically, vacuum tubes shattering on firing, circuits ceasing to function after exposure to artillery forces, batteries failing to activate or providing insufficient power. The breakthrough came through systematic engineering that addressed each component separately while maintaining focus on the integrated system. Vacuum tubes were redesigned with rugged construction, thick glass envelopes to resist shock, novel filament designs that could survive extreme acceleration, and getters that maintained vacuum integrity despite forces that would crack conventional tubes. The radio circuitry used a simple Doppler radar principle. The fuse transmits a continuous radio wave that reflects off the target, and the receiver detects frequency shifts caused by the closing distance between shell and target. When the Doppler shift reaches a predetermined threshold indicating optimal burst distance, a thyrotron tube triggers the detonator. The simplicity of this design, requiring no complex computation or timing mechanisms, proved essential to creating a system reliable enough for artillery use. Battery technology represented a critical challenge because conventional batteries cannot survive artillery firing and chemical batteries require time to activate. The solution involved inertial batteries that use the shell's acceleration during firing to close internal switches and initiate chemical reactions, providing power within milliseconds of leaving the gun muzzle. The batteries need to function for only 20 to 30 seconds, the typical flight time of an artillery shell, allowing designs optimized for rapid activation and short duration rather than long-term reliability. Safety mechanisms ensure the fuse arms only after experiencing the acceleration profile consistent with artillery firing, preventing premature detonation if shells are dropped or mishandled. Captain Thomas Henderson, a liaison officer from the Applied Physics Laboratory attached to artillery units in Europe, understands the VT fuse specifications intimately after months of training American gun crews in proper handling and employment. Each M47 proximity fuse measures 2.8 inches long and 1.5 inches in diameter, containing a transmitter operating at 180 to 220 MHz, a receiver tuned to detect Doppler-shifted returns, a miniature vacuum tube amplifier, a thyrotron trigger, and batteries that activate on firing. The fuse is designed to detonate the shell when it reaches approximately 15 to 30 feet above the target, the optimal height for maximizing fragmentation effects against personnel. The beauty of the system lies in its automatic operation. Gunners simply attach the fuse to shells, load and fire normally, and the physics of Doppler radar ensures optimal detonation height without any manual time setting or range calculation. American artillery doctrine for employing VT-fused ammunition emphasizes the weapon's effectiveness against area targets and massed formations, situations where airbursts maximize casualties by distributing fragments over wide areas. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McKenzie, commanding 2nd Battalion 109th Field Artillery Regiment, has received strict orders regarding VT fuse employment. Use them freely against German infantry formations, never fire them into areas where enemy forces might recover duds for technical analysis, and maintain absolute security about the fuse's existence and capabilities. The security classification exceeds that of most secret projects, with gun crews briefed that discussing VT fuses with anyone outside their immediate unit will result in court-martial.
The psychological impact of proximity-fused artillery on target personnel, predicted by military psychologists but untested in combat, derives from the weapon's apparent ability to find individuals regardless of dispersion or cover. Traditional artillery creates predictable patterns. Shells that impact on ground throw fragments primarily upward and to the sides. Soldiers in depressions or behind cover gain substantial protection, and spacing between personnel limits casualties per round. Proximity-fused shells, exploding at optimal height above ground, distribute fragments in a nearly spherical pattern that strikes soldiers from above, penetrates depressions and shallow cover, and creates effective casualty radii 2 to 3 times larger than ground bursts. The psychological impact of artillery that seems to search out individual soldiers, that makes dispersion and cover less effective, proves devastating to unit cohesion and morale.
German artillery doctrine, while sophisticated in many respects, has no framework for understanding or countering proximity-fused ammunition because German scientists and engineers have not developed equivalent technology. Intelligence reports occasionally mention American improved fuses or special ammunition, but German technical analysis assumes these references describe incremental improvements to conventional time fuses rather than revolutionary new technology. Captured American artillery ammunition undergoes cursory examination that notes unusual fuse designs but fails to comprehend the miniaturized radio systems within, partly because German radar technology remains too bulky for artillery applications and partly because the concept of Doppler detonated fuses falls outside German technical expectations. At 06:18 hours on December 23, 1944, American forward observers with clear fields of view, courtesy of the previous day's weather clearing, identify Oberstleutnant Hoffman's battalion advancing across snow-covered terrain toward Bastion's defensive perimeter. Fire direction centers receive target coordinates, calculate firing data from multiple batteries, and prepare time-on-target missions designed to saturate the German formation with simultaneous shell impacts. The orders specify M47 proximity fuses for 60% of rounds, with conventional impact fuses for the remainder to maintain capability against hardened targets. Gun crews work with practiced efficiency, loading shells, setting fuses according to specification, no time setting required for VT fuses, simply attach and fire, and preparing to fire on command. Oberstleutnant Hoffman, watching his company's advance in good order across terrain that provides limited cover but excellent fields of fire for his own weapons, calculates that his men will reach their assault positions in approximately 20 minutes, accepting that they will endure American artillery during the approach, but confident that proper dispersion and tactical movement will limit casualties to acceptable levels. His battalion has survived worse barrages, has lost men to artillery throughout the campaign, and has learned through bitter experience how to minimize exposure to enemy fire. The snow-covered ground actually works in his favor, making shell bursts visible from long distances and allowing soldiers to identify impact areas and adjust their routes accordingly. At 06:21 hours, the first American shells arc through the clear December sky. 64 105mm rounds fired from 8 guns in coordinated time-on-target mission calculated to impact simultaneously across the German battalion's frontage. The shells, invisible against the bright morning sky, reach their apogees and begin descending toward targets. German soldiers with experience recognize the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery, the sound that triggers trained responses, scanning for covered positions, dropping prone if caught in the open, continuing rapid movement if already exposed. Unteroffizier Weber shouts warning to his squad, the men spreading slightly wider, maintaining their advance while preparing mentally for the impact pattern they've experienced countless times before.
The first shells detonate at precisely 06:21 hours and 38 seconds, not on ground impact as German soldiers expect, but 25 feet above the snow-covered terrain where their radio proximity fuses detect the ground rushing up to meet them and trigger detonation at optimal height. The effect on German infantry proves devastating and completely unexpected. Traditional airbursts require soldiers to be relatively close to the impact point to suffer casualties, with most fragments passing harmlessly overhead or impacting ground beyond the immediate area. VT-fused shells exploding at optimal height distribute fragments in spherical patterns that strike everything within their effective radius, approximately 50 meters for lethal effects, 75 meters for wounding. Unteroffizier Weber experiences something unprecedented in his 3 years of combat. The shell burst that kills him detonates directly above his position despite his squad maintaining proper tactical spacing, the fragment striking from above at angles that make shallow depressions and snowbanks useless as protection. 6 of his 9 squad members die in the same instant, struck by fragments from a single airburst that conventional tactics said should wound at most 2 or 3 men. The squad's dispersion, their rapid movement, their use of available cover, all the techniques validated by years of combat experience, prove useless against weapons that detonate at precisely calculated heights to maximize casualties. Across Hoffman's battalion frontage, 38 shells fused with M47 proximity detonators explode within a 2-second period, their simultaneous impacts creating a wall of fragments that sweeps across the German formation like an invisible scythe. The remaining 26 shells, fused with conventional impact detonators, explode on ground contact as German soldiers expect, creating familiar patterns of fragments that trained infantry can anticipate and partially avoid. The contrast between conventional and proximity-fused bursts becomes immediately apparent to any observer. Impact-fused shells kill or wound soldiers within 25 to 30 meters of ground zero. Proximity-fused shells create casualties across areas exceeding 7,500 square meters per round. Hauptmann Koch, commanding 6th Company from a position 50 meters behind his lead platoons, watches his formation devastated in seconds by artillery that behaves unlike anything he's encountered in 5 years of combat. His lead platoon, 43 men, properly dispersed across 200 meters of frontage, ceases to exist as an organized unit when 3 proximity-fused shells detonate above them in rapid succession. The traditional calculations that said dispersed infantry would suffer limited casualties from area weapons no longer apply when each shell creates a lethal zone diameter exceeding 100 meters and the fragments strike from optimal angles to defeat hasty cover. The second American volley arrives at 06:22 hours and 15 seconds. Another 64 rounds, precisely timed to impact simultaneously, continuing the saturation bombardment that German doctrine says should allow survival through dispersion and movement. But German soldiers discovering that movement offers no protection when shells detonate automatically above them, that the traditional sprint through the beaten zone becomes a race through airbursts that find runners as easily as stationary targets. The proximity fuses don't care whether soldiers run or hide, maintain spacing or bunch together, use cover or remain exposed. The shells explode at heights calculated to maximize casualties regardless of target behavior.
Oberstleutnant Hoffman, watching his battalion disintegrate under artillery fire that kills with efficiency far exceeding anything in his experience, attempts to order withdrawal, but discovers his radio operators are casualties, his runners cannot traverse the beaten zone to deliver messages, and his companies have fractured into isolated groups of survivors, seeking any cover that might protect them from shells that explode overhead. The battalion's casualty rate after just 2 minutes of bombardment exceeds 40%, a level that would normally occur only after hours of intense combat or direct assault on fortified positions. The survivors, even the most veteran NCOs and officers, exhibit signs of panic that German military discipline normally prevents, abandoning equipment to run faster, clustering together despite training that emphasizes dispersion, in some cases simply lying prone and refusing to move despite orders. The psychological impact of proximity-fused artillery proves as devastating as the physical casualties because the weapon violates fundamental assumptions about artillery effects and survival techniques. German soldiers trained to believe that proper tactics could limit artillery casualties discover that their training means nothing against weapons that explode at optimal heights automatically. The apparent intelligence of shells that detonate above troops, regardless of their movements or cover, creates superstitious fear. Soldiers begin describing the shells as hunting individuals, as knowing where we are, as somehow targeting specific men rather than simply exploding according to mechanical timing. This attribution of intentionality to weapons following simple physical laws demonstrates the psychological disorientation created by encountering technology completely outside prior experience. Private Kurt Schneider, one of approximately 340 survivors from Hoffman's original 890-man battalion, will later describe the bombardment in terms that capture its psychological impact. The shells found us no matter what we did. We ran, they exploded above us. We hid in depressions, they exploded above us. We spread out as doctrine required, they exploded above each group. It was as if the Americans could see each individual soldier and placed a shell exactly above his position. Men who had survived 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front, who had endured Soviet artillery barrages involving thousands of rounds, broke completely under fire that lasted only 8 minutes but seemed to follow us like demons. The American artillery, having fired 6 volleys over 8 minutes, ceases fire at 06:29 hours, their ammunition expenditure carefully calculated to achieve desired effects without wasting the still limited supply of VT-fused rounds. Forward observers report German formation disrupted, survivors withdrawing in disorder, estimated casualties exceeding 60% of the original force. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie's after-action report notes ammunition expenditure of 384 rounds total, 230 fused with M47 proximity detonators, 154 with conventional impact fuses, achieving effects that previous experience suggested would require 1,500 to 2,000 rounds of time-fused ammunition, with much longer bombardment duration. The strategic impact of proximity-fused artillery extends beyond immediate tactical engagements to affect German operational planning throughout the Ardennes offensive. Attack timetables predicated on units reaching objectives with acceptable casualties despite Allied artillery opposition no longer hold when artillery proves 3 to 4 times more effective than historical experience suggests. Breakthrough operations that doctrine says should succeed despite Allied artillery superiority stall when lead formations suffer crippling casualties before reaching assault positions. The Ardennes offensive, already ambitious given German resource limitations, becomes militarily impossible once American forces deploy VT-fused ammunition in significant quantities. Captain Henderson, the Applied Physics Laboratory liaison officer, monitors field reports documenting VT-fuse effectiveness with scientific interest that sometimes seems detached from the human cost. His data shows proximity fuses achieve detonation success rates exceeding 92%, that optimal burst heights are maintained across varying terrain and weather conditions, that the automatic nature of the system eliminates gunner errors that reduce conventional artillery effectiveness. From a technical standpoint, the VT fuse represents complete success, a weapon system that functions as designed, achieves predicted effects, and operates reliably under combat conditions. The human dimension. German soldiers killed in unprecedented numbers by technology they cannot understand or counter, receives less attention in technical reports focused on system performance rather than battlefield consequences. The American soldiers witnessing VT fuse effects on German formations developed their own psychological responses to weapons that kill with mechanical efficiency. Sergeant First Class Anthony Martinez, forward observer who directed multiple missions using VT-fused ammunition, describes feeling uncomfortable with the systematic nature of the killing. With regular artillery, you know some rounds are going to miss, some fuses won't work right. Soldiers who are lucky or smart can survive even heavy barrages. With VT fuses, it's like every round finds its optimal killing position automatically. There's no luck involved, no chance for the other guy. It's just mechanical, efficient. It bothered me more than I expected, even though they're Germans and we're trying to kill them. The perfection of it felt wrong somehow. The technical security surrounding VT fuses remains absolute throughout their combat employment in Europe,
with elaborate measures ensuring German forces cannot examine intact fuses or comprehend their operating principles. Strict orders prohibit firing VT-fused ammunition into areas where German recovery is possible. Duds must be located and destroyed by friendly forces, and forward observers receive instructions to direct VT fire only where American ground forces can rapidly overrun target areas. These security measures prove successful. German technical intelligence never fully grasped the proximity fuse concept, attributing American artillery improvements to better manufacturing and fire control rather than revolutionary technology. By December 31, 1945, 8 days after Oberstleutnant Hoffman's battalion encountered proximity-fused artillery for the first time, American forces have fired over 200,000 VT-fused rounds in support of operations stopping the Ardennes offensive. The cumulative effect proves decisive. German attack formations suffer casualties far exceeding planning assumptions. Breakthrough operations stall under artillery fire that doctrine says should be survivable. And psychological impact of seemingly impossible artillery effectiveness degrades unit cohesion and morale among even elite formations. The Ardennes offensive, already ambitious due to German resource limitations, becomes impossible to sustain when a key German advantage, ability of disciplined infantry to survive Allied artillery through proper tactics, suddenly evaporates.
The technical investigation of proximity fuse effectiveness begins in earnest on January 2, 1945, when American ordnance teams analyze combat performance data collected from multiple artillery battalions employing VT-fused ammunition throughout the Ardennes campaign. Major Richard Blackwell, Chief of the Technical Analysis Section for 1st Army Artillery, compiles statistics that prove revolutionary. Proximity-fused 105mm shells achieve average casualty rates of 8.3 soldiers per round against dispersed infantry formations, compared to 2.1 casualties per round for conventional time-fused ammunition against identical targets. The fourfold improvement stems from consistent optimal burst heights that mechanical time fuses cannot reliably achieve, elimination of dud rates associated with impact fuses that strike soft ground, and the psychological effect of air bursts that appear to target individual soldiers regardless of tactical dispersion. The spread of proximity fuse technology to additional artillery units proceeds according to carefully planned schedules that balance combat effectiveness against security requirements. By January 5, 1945, approximately 40% of American artillery battalions in the European theater of operations have received authorization to employ VT-fused ammunition, with strict guidelines governing their use. Fire only in areas where friendly forces will rapidly advance to deny German access to duds. Maintain detailed expenditure records to account for every fused round, and never discuss the fuse's operating principles even with other American units not cleared for VT employment. The security measures reflect genuine concern that German technical intelligence might recover intact fuses and develop countermeasures, or worse, replicate the technology for their own use. German efforts to understand American artillery improvements intensify as field reports accumulate describing unprecedented effectiveness against dispersed formations. Oberst Hans Kruger, artillery specialist at OKW headquarters, analyzes reports from 17 separate engagements where German units suffered casualties far exceeding predictions based on conventional artillery effects. His analysis, completed January 8, 1945, concludes that Americans have achieved significant improvements in fuse reliability and possibly fire control accuracy, but fails to comprehend the fundamental technological breakthrough represented by proximity fuses. The report recommends increased emphasis on overhead cover, deeper entrenchments, and wider dispersion, countermeasures that prove marginally effective at best against weapons designed specifically to defeat such tactics. The contrast between American understanding of their weapons capabilities and German incomprehension of what they face creates tactical asymmetries that favor American operations throughout January 1945. American artillery commanders employ VT fuses with confidence born from understanding the physics of their operation. Every shell will detonate at optimal height regardless of terrain, weather, or target movement,
creating predictable casualty effects that allow precise calculation of ammunition requirements for desired tactical effects. German commanders operate with incomplete information, knowing American artillery has become more lethal but unable to determine why or develop effective countermeasures, leading to tactical planning based on obsolete assumptions about artillery survivability. The psychological impact on German soldiers who repeatedly experience proximity-fused artillery bombardment proves as significant as the physical casualties. Gefreiter Otto Braun, a veteran of the Eastern Front assigned to the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, describes the cumulative effect of multiple engagements under VT-fused artillery. After the third time experiencing the American improved shells, men began refusing to leave their bunkers when artillery fire was reported. They had learned that dispersal tactics taught in training offered no protection, that movement drew fire that found you regardless of speed or cover, that the only safety came from thick overhead protection or deep trenches. Unit cohesion suffered because soldiers no longer trusted that following proper tactics would ensure reasonable survival probability. The technical evolution of proximity fuse employment continues as American artillery units gain experience with the weapon's capabilities and limitations. Battery commanders discover that VT fuses prove most effective against infantry in open terrain or shallow entrenchments, somewhat less effective against troops in deep trenches with overhead cover, and relatively ineffective against armored vehicles where fragments lack sufficient velocity to penetrate armor plate. Doctrine evolves to emphasize VT employment against area targets and soft-skinned vehicles, while retaining conventional ammunition for hardened positions and direct-fire missions. The discrimination between target types allows efficient ammunition management that maximizes VT fuse impact on operations while conserving the still limited supply for situations where they provide decisive advantages. German attempts to develop tactical countermeasures against improved American artillery achieve limited success because they address symptoms rather than understanding root causes. Recommendations circulated to field units in mid-January emphasize construction of overhead cover using logs and earth, a labor-intensive process that provides protection against shell fragments but requires time and materials often unavailable during fluid operations. Increased dispersion proves counterproductive because proximity fuses maintain lethal effects at greater distances than conventional bursts, meaning wider spacing simply exposes more soldiers to effective fragment patterns. Faster movement through beaten zones, the traditional counter to artillery fire, becomes impossible when every shell detonates at optimal height regardless of timing, making speed of advance irrelevant to survival probability. The strategic implications of proximity-fused artillery extend beyond the immediate tactical engagements to affect German operational planning throughout the Western Front. Major General Otto Remmer, commanding the Führer-Begleit Brigade, reports on January 12 that his unit's attack capability has been fundamentally compromised by American artillery effectiveness that exceeds all previous experience. His brigade, designed for breakthrough operations requiring exposed advances across open terrain, cannot sustain offensive action when approach marches result in 40 to 50% casualties before reaching assault positions. Similar reports from multiple formations forced German commanders to abandon offensive operations requiring extended movements under American artillery observation, effectively surrendering initiative to Allied forces. The production and supply of proximity fuses is a significant industrial achievement that American manufacturing capacity makes possible despite the technical complexity of individual units. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory coordinates production across multiple contractors, with final assembly requiring skilled technicians who test each fuse to ensure proper operation. By January 1945, monthly production exceeds 400,000 units, sufficient to supply artillery battalions throughout Europe and the Pacific, while maintaining reserves for contingencies. The industrial capacity to produce hundreds of thousands of complex electronic devices monthly demonstrates American manufacturing advantages that German industry, crippled by strategic bombing and resource shortages, cannot match even if they fully understood the technology.
Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Simpson, commanding 3rd Battalion, 333rd Field Artillery Regiment, develops innovative tactics for employing VT-fused ammunition in coordination with infantry assaults. His techniques, documented in after-action reports that circulate throughout American artillery commands, emphasize timing bombardments to suppress German positions immediately before infantry advance, using the psychological shock of proximity-fused explosions to disrupt defensive coordination during the critical moments when attackers close with objectives. The tactics prove so effective that Simpson's battalion achieves attack success rates exceeding 85% against fortified positions, compared to historical averages around 60% for similar operations using conventional artillery preparation. German medical personnel treating casualties from proximity-fused artillery note unusual wound patterns that provide clues about American fuse improvements, though the significance goes unrecognized by technical intelligence. Dr. Heinrich Müller, serving with the 277th Volksgrenadier Division, documents in his medical log, "Recent weeks show increased incidence of downward-angled fragment wounds striking shoulders, back, and top of head. Previously, most artillery casualties showed lateral wounds from fragments traveling parallel to ground from impact bursts. The change suggests American shells consistently achieving optimal airburst heights that our time fuses rarely accomplish." Mueller's observation, accurate in every detail, remains buried in medical records rather than reaching intelligence analysts who might comprehend its implications. The weather conditions during January 1945, characterized by persistent overcast and frequent snow, actually enhance proximity fuse effectiveness by creating acoustic and visual conditions that make artillery detection difficult while having no effect on the radio-operated fuses. German soldiers, accustomed to hearing incoming shells and taking cover, discover that snow dampens sound, allowing proximity-fused rounds to arrive with minimal warning. The visual obscuration from falling snow prevents observation of shell trajectories that might allow evasive action, though such action would prove futile against fuses that detonate automatically at optimal heights regardless of target movement. American forward observers, the artillery specialists who direct fire missions from advanced positions with direct observation of targets, develop refined techniques for employing VT-fused ammunition. Captain Robert Hayes, serving with the 2nd Infantry Division, describes his methodology. "With VT fuses, I don't need to estimate range precisely or calculate time settings. I simply identify target coordinates, request VT fire mission, and know every round will detonate at optimal height. The simplification allows faster engagement of fleeting targets and eliminates the iteration typically required to achieve effective time settings. I can engage a German formation spotted moving across open ground and know the first volley will be devastating, rather than requiring adjustment fire." The security measures surrounding VT fuses occasionally create friction between artillery units authorized for employment and infantry units whose commanders wonder why artillery suddenly became dramatically more effective. Major Thomas O'Brien, Infantry Battalion Commander, submits inquiry in mid-January asking why recent artillery support achieved such superior results compared to previous operations. The response, classified secret special handling, explains only that improved ammunition and fire control techniques account for the enhanced effectiveness without revealing technical details of proximity fuses. O'Brien's frustration at being denied information about weapons supporting his operations reflects the tension between security requirements and commanders' desire to understand capabilities they depend upon. German signals intelligence intercepts American radio communications mentioning VT, or POSIT, proximity fuses, but lacks technical context to interpret the references meaningfully. Cryptanalysts note increased mention of these terms in artillery fire missions beginning in late December 1944, correlating temporally with reported increases in American artillery effectiveness. However, German intelligence assesses these references as American code words for improved time fuses or fire control techniques rather than revolutionary new technology, a misinterpretation that prevents development of appropriate countermeasures.
The cumulative effect of proximity-fused artillery on German combat effectiveness throughout January 1945 proves devastating to military operations already compromised by fuel shortages, personnel losses, and Allied air superiority. Units planning offensive operations must now assume artillery will inflict 2 to 3 times historical casualty rates during approach marches, forcing allocation of additional forces to achieve objectives or abandonment of operations entirely. Defensive operations become increasingly passive as commanders hesitate to maneuver units under American artillery observation, knowing that movement invites bombardment likely to cause catastrophic casualties. The psychological impact of artillery that seems impossibly effective further degrades morale among German soldiers already demoralized by the failure of the Ardennes offensive and growing recognition that Germany cannot win the war.
American artillery commanders in post-war interviews consistently cite proximity fuses as enabling the rapid advances of March-April 1945 that culminated in German collapse. General Jacob Devers, commanding 6th Army Group, stated, "VT fuses allowed us to neutralize German defensive positions with artillery preparation lasting hours rather than days, reducing ammunition expenditure while increasing effectiveness. The time savings translated directly into operational tempo that prevented German forces from establishing successive defensive lines. We could break through, advance rapidly while Germans were still disorganized, and engage their next position before they completed preparations. The traditional offensive cycle of prepare, attack, consolidate, prepare shortened dramatically, giving Germans no time to recover." The philosophical implications of weapons that automate killing through physics and mathematics rather than human judgment troubled some observers even during wartime. Chaplain Captain James Morrison, serving with an artillery battalion, wrote in his diary, "The VT fuse represents a disturbing evolution in warfare, a weapon that kills through mechanical precision without requiring the gunner to see or consciously target individual enemies. The artilleryman simply loads and fires. The fuse's internal mechanisms determine who dies based on proximity calculations. There is something dehumanizing about this automation of death, even when employed against enemies who would kill us if they could. War has always involved killing at distance, but these fuses seem to cross some threshold into killing as industrial process." The final statistical analysis of proximity fuse employment in Europe, compiled in August 1945, documents approximately 22 million VT-fused rounds fired between December 1944 and May 1945, achieving estimated 180,000 to 220,000 enemy casualties directly attributable to the improved ammunition. The cost-benefit calculation proves overwhelming at approximately $18 per VT fuse versus 50 cents for conventional fuses. The additional expense of $385 million bought casualties that conventional ammunition could have achieved only with perhaps 60 to 80 million rounds, costing over $500 million, plus the logistics burden of moving 4 times the ammunition weight. The return on investment, both financial and tactical, validated the massive research and development program that created proximity fuses. The legacy of German soldiers who survived proximity-fused artillery includes not just physical wounds, but psychological scars from encountering weapons that seemed to violate natural laws of warfare. Kurt Schneider, the private who survived Oberstleutnant Hoffman's battalion destruction, spent decades unable to tolerate thunderstorms because the sound triggered memories of shells exploding overhead with impossible precision. His testimony, recorded for the German Military History Archive in 1978, captures the lasting impact. "We had learned through years of war how to survive artillery through proper tactics and reasonable luck. The American improved shells, we never knew they were called proximity fuses, destroyed our confidence that skill and training mattered. Survival became random chance, no longer connected to our actions or decisions. That helplessness, that inability to influence our own fate, broke something in many survivors that never fully healed."
The story of proximity-fused artillery ultimately demonstrates how technological innovation can achieve decisive military advantage when physical principles are harnessed to solve tactical problems. The Germans, despite sophisticated understanding of radar and artillery, never conceived that miniaturization and ruggedization could bring the technologies together in artillery shells. American engineers, approaching the problem without preconceptions about feasibility, created weapons that transformed artillery from an area weapon of limited effectiveness into precision instruments of devastating lethality. The shells that found Oberstleutnant Hoffman's battalion in December 1944 represented not just better fuses, but a fundamental reimagining of what artillery could accomplish. Physics and mathematics replacing luck and approximation, automated precision replacing manual time setting, guaranteed optimal burst heights replacing variable and often ineffective conventional fuses. The revolution in artillery effectiveness achieved through VT fuses proved as significant as any weapons development of World War II, ending German offensive capability, accelerating Allied victory, and establishing principles that continue shaping artillery design 8 decades later.